Welcome to another episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and co-producer here on Untitled Media alongside Suleiman Hashi and engineer Yassine. I and everybody here at Untitled Media would like to every Somali, wherever they are in the world, a happy National Flag Day. It was 67 years ago today, on October 12th, 1954, that Muhammad Awali Liban's designed Somali flag was first raised on Somali soil. Additionally, Untitled Media would also like to congratulate every Somali and the Somali nation in this most historic victory at the ICJ just a few hours ago. Although Somalia deserves 100% of its maritime territory and not just 80%, nevertheless, we must celebrate a victory because that's what it is. Currently, Behind the Scenes is analysing the ICJ verdict and report and will provide an in-depth special episode into the ICJ case, including both Somalia and Kenya's positions, as well as the ICJ verdict and its reasoning. Do stay tuned for next week. However, on this week's episode, Behind the Scene provides background analysis into how the ICJ case came about. Firstly, we'll be analysing how and why did Somalia enter a maritime dispute with Kenya, resulting in an ICJ case that lasted years. And secondly, Kenya released a statement elucidating Nairobi will not acknowledge any verdict reached by the ICJ. Now, what does this mean for Somalia and international law in general? Those are the topics on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to Untitled Media. Let's get straight into it. Many people following Somalia as of late are probably wondering, how on earth did Somalia enter an ICJ case with Kenya, despite the fact that the water in dispute categorically belongs to Somalia and always did? To answer such a question, we need to backtrack over a decade ago to 2009. During this period, Somalia was legally governed by a skeleton transitional government led by the former Islamic Courts Union leader Sheikh Sharif Sheikh Ahmed. While this administration was not directly elected by the Somali people, it did gain the approval of a small number of Somali clan elders, although questionably, and the international community. President Ahmed appointed the son of Alaa Naxariisto, the former SYL Prime Minister and President Abdirashiid Sharmaake, Umar Sharmaake, as Prime Minister of Somalia in February 2009. Now, in April 2009, the Somali Transitional Government and Kenya signed a now infamous Memorandum of Understanding to grant each other no objection in respect of submissions on the outer limits of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautic miles to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. This was signed by the then Kenyan Foreign Minister Moses Wetangula and the Somali Minister of Planning and International Cooperation Abdurrahman Abdushakur Warsame. Now, what this means is that both countries gave each other the green light without any legal objection or issue to enable the other to submit an adjustment to the continental shelf beyond the original 200 nautic miles between the two nations to the UNCLCS and accept whatever verdict is reached by that commission. Now, for those who do not understand, a continental shelf is an area of a seabed around a large landmass where the sea is relatively shallow. So this area will be very close to the coast. A nautic miles just generally refers to the exclusive economic zone extending from the baseline of a country to the maximum 200 nautic miles as prescribed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of Sea. This information is quite critical to this case. Now, under this convention, sovereign states have special rights regarding the exploration and use of marine resources. Now, immediately after the signing of the agreement, the Secretariat of the United Nations registered the MOU on the 11th of June 2009 at Kenya's request. However, what did the MOU say exactly? Now, without getting into too much details on it, the first 5 paragraphs indicate the purpose of ensuring that the CLCS Commission could proceed to consider the submissions made by Kenya and Somalia. However, the most controversial element in this MOU is paragraph 6, which states that the delimitation of maritime boundaries in the areas under dispute shall be agreed between the two coastal states on the basis of international law after the Commission of the Continental Shelf made its recommendations concerning the establishment of the outer limits of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautic miles. The paragraph stipulates, and I quote, among others, the continental shelf beyond the 200 nautic miles, and doesn't refer to in any way the exclusive economic zone of around 42,000 kilometers currently claimed by Kenya. Furthermore, the wording of the title, as well as the first 5 paragraphs, did not contain any obligations on how the dispute should be resolved. This was also highlighted by the court following its own analysis. Additionally, the MOU further stated that the CLCS Commission could produce to consider submissions of only the outer limits of the continental shelf and not the whole maritime boundary between the two countries, which suggests that it did not create a dispute settlement procedure for the determination of that boundary. As a result, it is evident in both the eyes of the court and legal experts that the argument put forth by the Kenyan government that there was an out-of-court settlement is incorrect, and this was again reached by the ICJ just today. By August 2009, the Prime Minister Sirdoonka sent a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations in which he stated the following, and I quote, "He acknowledged that Kenya is claiming a portion of Somalia's nautic miles." The former Prime Minister also stated the area of the Somali coast claimed by Kenya and Somalia must be interpreted, and I quote, "an area under dispute." He also outlined that the Somali and Kenyan governments, and I quote, "both duly authorized," end quote, the signing of the MOU, which granted each nation a no objection in respect of submission to the CLCS Commission and its verdict. He also acknowledged that his own government gave consent to the UN Commission to consider the submissions made by Kenya over its claims without regard, and I quote, "to maritime boundaries between the two countries." He ended his letter with a reiteration of Somalia's consent for the MOU and procedure. What is important here is that despite the fact that the Somali Prime Minister seems to be accepting certain elements of the MOU, as the ICJ has stated, and as I have aforementioned above, the MOU does not create a dispute settlement procedure and was solely limited to the nautic miles rather than a large claim put forth by Nairobi. Now, the Somali Federal Parliament outright rejected the MOU reached between Sheikh Sharif's administration and Nairobi. In a heated set of debates and discussions, Parliament voted 337 against the agreement, with 9 in favour of postponement and 4 supporting the creation of a committee to investigate the MOU and its intentions. It is of the essence in any democratic nation that the 3 pillars of governance work harmonically and simultaneously to ensure the effective accountability, scrutiny, and ruling of government. Parliament represents the people, and despite the fact that the Somali Transitional Parliament was selected by a handful of Somali elders, it still remained the only body that represented the interests of the Somali people in some way or form. Ignoring or disregarding the will of Parliament would amount to a gross neglect of basic democratic principles of governance. And what is important here, and what I'm emphasizing again, is that not a single MP voted in favour of this MOU. Yet despite this, President Sharif stated in a televised interview in 2009 that he categorically disagreed with the Parliament's decision, elucidating that the government had every right to reach an MOU with Kenya, while simultaneously brushing aside accusations of giving Somalia's sea away to Kenya as merely, and I quote, propaganda. Surprisingly, in his 2016 presidential campaign, Sheikh Sharif outright denied that he had any knowledge of such an agreement, stating that the blame solely lied with the Prime Minister and his government. Now, what I fail to understand is how a president of an entire nation is unaware of an agreement reached by its government. Prime Minister Sirdoonka was directly subordinate to the president. Now, based on Sharif's denial, 2 things can be concluded. One is that Sharif is a highly incompetent leader that is completely unaware of the major deals or activities his government is engaged with foreign countries. Therefore, he could never be trusted to run office again due to his lack of competency. Or 2, Sharif is blatantly lying to the Somali people about his involvement in this agreement and his knowledge about it. Either way, what can be answered from both types of conclusions is that Sharif is not a competent leader, and he cannot steer Somalia in the direction it needs right now to rebuild itself. Additionally, Sharif has major responsibility in the Somali-Kenyan maritime dispute and must be held accountable, or to the bare minimum questioned about his role in an open court of law. The reality is that Somalia has been an independent nation bordering Kenya for 49 years, with Kenya being an independent nation bordering Somalia for 46 years by the time a maritime dispute was raised by Kenya in 2009. Not once was this issue raised by Kenya under almost half a century it bordered Somalia, having even openly signed a multitude of agreements with the central government of Somalia in the 70s and the 80s. What is clear and evident is that the MOU signed by Sharif administration, led by Prime Minister Caalamka, gave the opportunity for Kenya to raise an unprecedented dispute in an attempt to redefine borders between the two nations. Prior to this date, an issue concerning the maritime border was never raised. A number of important elements appear that must be really analysed by the viewers. 1. Kenya attempted to take advantage of Somalia's lack of stable government and security forces to gain more maritime territory. 2. Somalia's leaders in 2009 either negligently or willfully signed an agreement which essentially put Somalia's territorial integrity into dispute. And 3. The Somali parliament nor the Somali people gave the go-ahead for an unaccounted and unelected Somali government to discuss the nation's border with any other state. Now, moving on to Kenya. Kenya has stated in a press statement that it will not recognize the ICJ verdict irrespective of the outcome, citing, and I quote, bias. Now, interestingly, both countries recognize the ICJ's jurisdiction based on the declarations under Article 36, Paragraph 2 of the Statute of the Court submitted by Somalia in 1963 and Kenya in 1965. In fact, at the time, both nations said that the recognition came with, quote, no condition or reservation to either declarations. Additionally, the Kenyan government had no issue with the court previously, as it had submitted multiple arguments in favor of this case between 2014 and 2018. It was only when Kenya realized that its case was weak and would be thrown out of the court that it backtracked and decided not to recognize the court in a futile attempt to seek an out-of-court remedy to no avail. The reality is that under Article 94 of the UN Charter, each member of the UN undertakes to comply with the decisions of the court in any case to which it is a party. These judgments are final and without an appeal. If there is a dispute about the meaning or the judgment, the only possibility is for one of the parties to take or make a request to the court for an interpretation. However, while it is binding, as stipulated under Article 94 of the UN Charter, the enforcement of a verdict is very difficult in the practical sense, as the ICJ doesn't have an enforcement wing to ensure countries abide by the rules. The reality is that when one assesses international relations, relations are more anarchy than more established, as you would see within a nation. The relations between nations are more unstable than relations within a nation between citizens. And that's what people need to understand as to why it's so difficult for any international body to enforce any kind of law that it judges or passes on any other country. Nevertheless, one must understand that any decision by Kenya to ignore the verdict would essentially tarnish its nation's international reputation in terms of its respect for international law and diplomatic norms. The Kenyan government rejecting the court's ruling would damage its international standing, and the ICJ verdict also gives Somalia a substantially stronger diplomatic presence in the Indian Ocean, with Mogadishu now able to exert diplomatic pressure with the direct support of the United Nations and Somalia's own allies. It is now for Somalia to sign a defense agreement with our allies in Turkey. The Kenyan government already earlier this year signed a defense pact, a 5-year defense pact to be exact, with the UK, which would see thousands of Kenyan troops trained by British armed forces. With Kenya now refusing to recognize, or at least threatening to refuse to recognize the ICJ case, Somalia needs its seafront protected. While it cannot purchase heavy armaments due to an arms embargo at the UN, which has been in force since 1993, the support of the Turkish Navy in Somali waters would be an excellent deterrent for neighboring countries, including Kenya, from violating Somalia's maritime sovereignty again until Somalia is able to rebuild its navy, and it will be excellent to see the current government do this.